Between 1870 and 1880, a missionary-run shelter located near the outer edge of New Orleans operated under a name meant to inspire trust, the St. Fortunatus Children's Refuge. Meant to care for abandoned minors, it quickly became the subject of local unease. Rumors surfaced, records vanished, and 13 children disappeared within a 2-year span. Despite minor press coverage at the time, no formal investigations followed. The building was later sold, repainted, and its records quietly sealed. It was as if the shelter and its children had never existed. The St. Fortunatus Children's Refuge was introduced as a private initiative supported by visiting Protestant benefactors from the Northeast. Publicly, it was framed as a haven for orphans and displaced children after the disruptions of the Civil War. Church bulletins praised its outreach. City officials acknowledged it briefly as a model of self-sufficient reform. Yet no child ever graduated from its care into traceable public life. By 1882, the property was shuttered, and the church that once operated it no longer listed the facility in its records. The names of the 13 missing children were never entered into city registries. By the beginning of 1872, the St. Fortunatus Children's Refuge had become a familiar reference point for those moving along the northeastern edge of New Orleans. Its outer wall, modest and functional, enclosed a parcel of land separated from the city's main activity by 2 miles of mostly undeveloped ground. The refuge had been established on the former site of a failed boarding academy, which had been purchased in 1869 by a modestly funded Protestant alliance affiliated with the Independent Missionary Society of the Atlantic South. The building itself had been repurposed without much structural change. It retained the long rectangular dormitories typical of antebellum educational buildings, with a narrow central hall dividing the girls' and boys' quarters. A larger room in the front served administrative purposes, though it was never referred to as an office. The staff called it the receiving room, a term borrowed from older institutions where outside contact was regulated by spatial boundaries rather than social ones. Local newspapers noted the project in small blurbs, emphasizing the good intentions of its founders rather than the details of its operations. The New Orleans Register described it in May 1871 as a charitable outpost dedicated to the moral and logistical uplift of discarded youth. The phrase discarded youth was never clarified, no exact criteria were published for intake, and the children's identities were not documented in public ledgers. Visitors who approached the building were typically turned away, unless they had written permission from the society's representatives. The property was not advertised as open to the public. A sign on the gate read only, "Private Sanctuary." Even delivery persons were instructed to leave parcels outside and wait behind the gate. Contact was limited and directional. The outside world sent things in. Nothing visible came out. The man assigned to direct the facility was Reverend Alton Ferris, a former schoolteacher from coastal Massachusetts who had gained minor recognition for organizing aid caravans after the flooding of Yazoo County in 1868. He had no formal theological training beyond what he described as field scripture studies, and no documented experience in child welfare. His appointment came directly from the Northeastern Board, which claimed to favor administrators with demonstrated moral clarity and resilience in unsettled territories. No public record shows any competitive selection process. Ferris did not arrive alone. He brought with him 3 staff members, each referred to only by their last names in later correspondence: Marwood, Ellis, and Keppel. The society never clarified whether these were surnames or assigned identifiers. Marwood handled supplies, Ellis maintained written correspondence, and Keppel was in charge of internal order, a vague term that was never fully defined in any publication or report. Keppel's name appears the least in surviving documents. The institution began with an intake of 17 children in its first 3 months, all described in ledgers as voluntary arrivals. The source of this voluntary intake is unclear. Some were reportedly referred by nearby religious groups, others from city-based orphan committees. Yet no consistent referral mechanism was ever recorded. Local parishes stated in later years that they had no formal contact with the facility. When asked about the origin of the first 17 children, a local alderman simply replied that they must have come from somewhere. Conditions inside the refuge were never publicly documented. No official tours were conducted. The Missionary Society published annual summaries, but these reports emphasized theological framing over practical detail. A common phrase repeated across several years was that the children are in correctional proximity to doctrine, which offered no insight into daily life, staffing ratios, or educational structure. Attempts by city council members to visit the facility in 1874 were denied due to scheduling constraints. Afterward, no further visits were requested. Public curiosity about the shelter remained limited, possibly due to its geographic isolation and the region's political fragmentation during Reconstruction. The few locals who lived near the property stated that they occasionally saw small groups of children in the garden area, but were never invited onto the grounds. One neighbor, a retired pharmacist named Lionel Durney, later recalled that the children moved quietly and always in even numbers, never alone. By late 1873, the mission published a report stating that the refugee now housed 26 children. The same report included a short entry stating that 5 had been transferred under discretion. No destination was listed. The report did not clarify whether the transfer involved adoption, relocation to another facility, or removal from care. This phrase, transferred under discretion, became standard in later summaries. In total, it was used 13 times between 1873 and 1875. In the following months, official mentions of the shelter decreased. The Independent Missionary Society redirected its attention to a new facility under construction near Mobile, Alabama. Administrative notes from board meetings suggest that the New Orleans site was no longer receiving financial priority, although it continued to operate without interruption. There were no allegations, complaints, or documented incidents that would have triggered closure. It was not shuttered. It was simply moved down the list of strategic priorities. No images or illustrations of the children inside the refuge were ever published. The only known visual depiction of the facility comes from a hand-drawn diagram submitted with a supply requisition form in 1874. The diagram showed a central building with 2 auxiliary wings, one labeled instruction, the other retention. No explanation of these terms was included. The Society's report referred to the sketch as a provisional outline for logistical purposes. Between 1874 and 1875, references to the number of children in care became inconsistent. One report mentioned 21, another mentioned 24. A notation in the margin of an internal memo, attributed to Ellis, questioned the accuracy of the register, citing unsynchronized documentation. This issue was never addressed in subsequent reports. The ledger from 1875 included a list of names with abbreviated notations beside each. Many of these notations were symbols rather than words. A triangle appeared beside one name, a circle beside another. A cross-hatched box appeared beside 3 names, with no legend to explain their meanings. Annotations using non-verbal marks became increasingly common in later records. In early 1876, an inquiry was submitted by a city clerk who had received an anonymous letter questioning the legal custody status of the children at the refuge. The letter contained no signature, but included photocopies of 2 pages from what appeared to be an internal roster. The roster pages showed a list of children's first names only, with 5 of them underlined in red. The clerk passed the letter to the Office of Public Welfare, which then filed it without action. The letter's envelope was discarded before any tracing could be attempted. No follow-up investigation was launched. According to a note attached to the Welfare Office's internal file, the matter was considered outside jurisdiction because the shelter was a religious facility operating under federal charter. The legal framework at the time did not obligate religious charities to disclose internal records unless a formal complaint was filed by a legal guardian. No such complaint was ever registered. The following year marked a shift in the administrative rhythm of the refuge. In place of detailed quarterly notes, the Independent Missionary Society issued a single consolidated statement in December 1877. It contained fewer figures and more general remarks. The report stated that structural readjustments and internal realignments have been satisfactorily concluded, offering no indication of what changes had occurred. The document listed only 19 children in residence, though previous documents had referenced higher numbers. A peripheral line in the same report mentioned that extractions due to oversight irregularities have been reconciled. No dates, names, or explanations were included. The language used became increasingly detached from common terminology, relying on phrases that lacked public clarity. When compared to earlier entries, the terminology shift marked a clear departure from operational transparency, even within the Society's own limited disclosure norms. Minutes from board meetings held in early 1878 reflected growing internal divisions. Some members raised concerns about the inconsistent reports coming from the New Orleans branch. One member requested an external audit of the facility's intake and release records, citing non-coherent custody transitions as an area of concern. The proposal was brought to vote, but ultimately dismissed by majority decision. The dissenting members left no further comment and did not raise the issue again in subsequent meetings. By mid-1878, local cartographic records adjusted the site's designation from child refuge to mission estate. This change appeared in the updated municipal land ledger without notification to neighboring property holders. The land designation shift did not correspond with any recorded property transaction. It appeared to be administrative in nature and likely initiated by the Society's legal representative, whose name appears on the revised deed as a signatory rather than an owner. At this time, Reverend Ferris was still listed as director, though no personal correspondence bearing his name can be found after March of that year. His last known letter, addressed to the Society's regional office, referenced a structural repair to the south corridor of the facility and requested assistance with regrading the garden area. The handwriting on the document is notably different from earlier letters. Later analysis by city archivists suggested the final note may have been transcribed by another party on Ferris's behalf. In 1879, a short notice appeared in the shipping log of the Louisiana Port Bureau regarding a crate of unused hymnals marked for return to Providence, Rhode Island. The sender was listed as SFCR, a common abbreviation used by staff for the St. Fortunatus Children's Refuge. This notation marked the last known trace of the institution's engagement with outside logistics. No further deliveries, shipments, or requisition forms have been found beyond this date. At the municipal level, the facility's presence became increasingly ambiguous. Tax documents from 1880 list the site under a broader religious holdings category, which exempted it from certain civic fees. The document labeled the facility as inactive, a designation reserved for properties still under title, but without declared operational status. This classification allowed the building to remain closed to inspections under religious exemption clauses still in place from earlier federal acts. The staff members listed in earlier ledgers no longer appear in city registries after 1880. Marwood, Ellis, and Keppel were not found in later census records, and their names were not associated with other missionary locations affiliated with the Independent Missionary Society. No forwarding addresses or assignment reclassifications were recorded. The personnel file for the New Orleans mission was marked closed with resolution, but the associated resolution was not attached to the final report. In the years that followed, the site remained physically intact, but functionally silent. Windows were boarded from the inside. The gate remained locked. A sign posted by a local maintenance worker read, "Unoccupied religious property." The grass continued to be trimmed every 2 months, but no one saw who carried out the maintenance. Local accounts described seeing lantern light behind the upper windows at night, though this detail was never verified by authorities and remained within the realm of neighborhood speculation. In 1882, the Society divested from the property without public notice. A real estate exchange, filed through a third-party agent in Baton Rouge, transferred ownership to a private trust with no listed beneficiaries. The documentation was minimal. It included no reference to previous use, occupancy, or the building's past designation. The transfer document labeled the property only by its parcel number and lot description, omitting the name St. Fortunatus entirely. That same year, the Independent Missionary Society removed all mention of the New Orleans location from its annual publications. The map insert, traditionally included with its year-end bulletin, no longer marked the site. Corresponding footnotes were deleted. In the internal reference index used by staff for property cross-checks, the page allocated to the refuge was left blank. Inquiries to the Society regarding the New Orleans location received uniform replies. Letters were returned with a printed card stating that the site in question is no longer under ecclesiastical operation. No further correspondence was entertained. Staff at the regional office in Savannah were instructed not to discuss the matter with unaffiliated parties. Over time, the facility's absence from public conversation became complete. The building remained, but its institutional identity was fully erased from the Society's official narrative. A final anomaly appeared in the municipal ledger in 1884. A clerk reviewing historical tax categories for religious holdings found a discrepancy involving the St. Fortunatus parcel. A note scribbled in the margin read, "Inquiry pending, title lapse suspected." The inquiry was marked as resolved 1 month later, but no explanation was entered. The clerk who filed the note, identified only by initials, was later transferred to another department. By the end of the decade, the building had been acquired by a local civic group with no stated religious affiliation. They used it for storage and occasional meetings, but made no renovations. The original interior structure was left unchanged. During a maintenance inspection in 1889, a contractor noted that one wing of the building remained locked and inaccessible. When asked whether it should be opened, the new owners declined. They stated the room was of no current importance and requested it be left undisturbed. Over the next 10 years, the building faded from active memory. Its presence on city maps diminished, then disappeared. Neighborhood directories no longer listed it. The fence deteriorated. Ivy grew along the eastern wall. The name St. Fortunatus was not referenced again in any local document until decades later, when a historian compiling a list of post-war missionary efforts discovered a gap in the Society's published timeline. When contacted, the Society acknowledged the existence of the site only in passing. They described it as an early auxiliary location with limited documentation. No further comment was provided. The gap remained unexplained. No staff members from the period were still living. No children were ever identified as having resided in the facility. No official statement was issued to account for its closure. In the spring of 1873, a small article appeared on page 4 of the New Orleans Weekly Examiner. It contained fewer than 100 words and was situated between unrelated notices for furniture auctions and ferry schedules. The article mentioned the relocation of 2 children from a Protestant mission facility to an unspecified rural home for purposes of vocational advancement. No names were provided. The location of the mission was not stated, nor was the facility directly identified. But the initials SF in the article's subheading matched those used in other records associated with the St. Fortunatus Children's Refuge. The brief reference attracted no attention at the time. Most such articles were written using pre-approved phrasing supplied by regional church offices and were never subject to editorial review. These notices served a bureaucratic rather than informative function. They confirmed activity, aligned with expected standards of child placement, and filled column inches. No further entries on these 2 children were found in subsequent editions. No return visit was mentioned. No occupational outcome was recorded. Similar notices appeared sporadically in other publications over the next year. Each was distinct in language, but consistent in vagueness. One report spoke of a transition to academic apprenticeship in a nearby county, while another referenced relocation under the guidance of rural instruction facilitators. All of them listed no formal address, date, or contact recipient. The phrasing avoided permanence, and the language used carried no legal weight. They offered no opportunity for follow-up, no avenue for inquiry. Their purpose was surface continuity, not disclosure. An anomaly appeared in August 1874, when the Orleans Parish Children's Registry recorded a visit from a woman identifying herself as a temporary caregiver for one of the children previously listed in the 1872 intake documents. The registry logbook noted that she requested transfer verification for a child named Isaac, whose surname was not provided. She carried a hand-copied letter on unmarked paper, signed with the name Ferris. The content of the letter was brief and lacked identifying details. The clerk marked the interaction as incomplete, citing insufficient credentialing. No follow-up appointment was scheduled. The woman did not return. No correspondence followed. The logbook page included a short marginal annotation reading likely confusion with informal houses. The phrase informal houses was used at the time to describe unregulated shelters, often short-term, with limited oversight. Whether the woman had visited other locations prior to contacting the registry is unknown. Her name was recorded as Mrs. Dell, with no additional information. 2 months later, a different inquiry reached the Municipal Record Office. This time a letter was submitted by a rural pastor in Plaquemines Parish, requesting assistance in verifying the origin of a child recently brought under his congregation's care. The child, aged approximately 10, had no known family name and had been left in the care of the church by a man identifying himself only as a traveling steward. The pastor's letter stated that the man claimed to have received the child through a mission placement south of the Tremé line. The only such facility in that area during the relevant period was St. Fortunatus. The response from the record office was non-committal. The clerk suggested contacting the Missionary Society directly. No indication was given as to whether this was done. The child's name, if one was eventually assigned, did not appear in any public registry. The pastor's church was later absorbed into another congregation. No records from its brief operational period have survived. These isolated inquiries reflect a pattern that continued throughout the mid-1870s. Individual attempts to clarify the status of specific children failed due to inconsistent documentation, lack of follow-through, or ambiguous authority. The legal structure of child guardianship at the time did not require central registration for private institutions. Transfers between facilities, families, or religious overseers were often handled internally and without formal reporting. The only required condition was the absence of public complaint. In the case of St. Fortunatus, no complaint was ever officially registered during its years of activity. In December 1875, an unsigned memo circulated within the Independent Missionary Society's Internal Review Committee. The memo questioned the protocol for verifying outplacement destinations for children listed as transferred under discretion. The memo contained no accusation. It posed a theoretical question. What procedural checks ensured that such transfers were both recorded and reversible? The response, marked by the initials of a senior board member, read, "Facilities assigned trust are to retain internal responsibility. External certification is inconsistent with ecclesiastical autonomy." This exchange, like many internal society communications, remained unpublished at the time. Only decades later, through archival reviews, would such documents become part of a larger understanding. During the operational years of the refuge, no mechanism existed to verify the location, condition, or future of children once they left its grounds. The Society's own language made review impossible. Autonomy was prioritized over accountability. Trust was embedded structurally, not earned or tested. In 1876, the first vague reference to irregularities appeared in the minutes of a city council meeting. The council was reviewing regional charity reports when a delegate raised a question about the absence of formal discharge records from private missionary facilities. The delegate did not name St. Fortunatus specifically, but cited a location operating northeast of Faubourg Marigny with no listed transitions. The matter was referred to the Committee on Benevolent Oversight, which filed a note indicating no basis for intervention. Religious exemptions remained in effect. The committee concluded that any action would require coordination with federal liaisons, which at that time were not stationed in Louisiana. By early 1877, questions surrounding the reliability of child placement records began appearing in non-governmental circles. A small academic group associated with the Louisiana State Institute for Social Research included a paragraph in their quarterly bulletin noting unverifiable child migration across parish lines. Though the reference was general and included no specific institutions, The authors highlighted the difficulties of maintaining regional tracking systems for minors relocated under religious auspices. The bulletin cited missing connective documentation as a growing concern. The issue never progressed beyond private discussion. There were no investigative bodies tasked with oversight of mission facilities unless prompted by court action. Without legal complaints or public testimony, missionary locations were allowed to self-regulate. Internal inconsistencies were viewed as procedural gaps, not violations. The threshold for formal inquiry was not met. Meanwhile, anecdotal references continued to surface in local correspondence. One such instance occurred in a letter from a volunteer nurse working with a riverboat infirmary, who described receiving a child in 1878, bearing a name stitched into her collar from a mission school, though no school name was recognizable. The child, described only as quiet and unsure, was never matched to any existing roster. The infirmary logbook for that month contains no further identifying data. The fabric of the institution's operation remained outwardly intact. The building stood. Its grounds were maintained. The staff names remained consistent in documents that continued to reference the site through at least 1879. But the structure of verification, who arrived, who left under what circumstances, became increasingly opaque. The refugee continued to generate references in supply invoices, shipping forms, and regional church directories. Yet none of these documents answered the underlying questions posed by earlier observers. Inquiries into financial expenditures yielded no resolution. Funding came primarily from the northeastern chapters of the Missionary Society, pooled into shared accounts and allocated without itemized transparency. Annual budgets were submitted with minimal breakdowns, and spending for each location was aggregated under general headings. St. Fortunatus received a stable allocation of funds through 1880, but no specifics were given for how that funding supported particular individuals, services, or transitions. As external visibility diminished, even routine entries began to rely on approximation. Intake numbers were given in ranges. Staff responsibilities were described using non-functional language. Terminology like moral ordering, internal realignment, and transition optimization replaced concrete administrative terms. The language concealed more than it clarified. Even within the society, clarity had become secondary to consistency. By the close of 1879, private letters among former regional affiliates referenced the New Orleans mission in past tense, even though no official closure had been announced. One such letter, written by a society representative in Florida, mentioned that the property near the river bend is no longer in play. Another described it as absorbed through administrative silence. These phrases suggested a functional withdrawal masked as continuity. The building still stood. The name still appeared in records, but operations, as they had existed in earlier years, had slowed or ceased altogether. In early 1880, a private ledger used by the Independent Missionary Society recorded the receipt of a final disbursement tagged to the New Orleans location. The entry, marked with a red underline, allocated a fixed amount designated for closure protocol facilitation. This was the only time the term appeared in society records. No companion documentation accompanied the entry. The ledger's remaining pages for that fiscal quarter were left blank. The New Orleans property was not mentioned again in financial updates issued thereafter. City records from that same period do not indicate any official closure notification. In fact, the Municipal Property Registry continued to list the parcel as a religious refuge through 1882. The discrepancy between the Society's internal notation and the city's documentation was not reconciled. This gap allowed the building to remain under the legal protections of religious status while ceasing all visible function. It remained listed, tax-exempt, and unvisited. An employee at the Office of Municipal Records, reviewing zoning updates in June 1881, flagged the refuge site for unexplained inactivity. The reviewer, a junior clerk named Thomas Renier, noted in a side comment that the structure retains designation but shows no civic linkage. His observation did not prompt formal review. He appended a referral to the Committee on Religious Holdings, which issued a default confirmation that the property had not violated its standing exemption. No further inspection was scheduled. Over the following year, several maps redrew boundaries in the district surrounding the former refuge. A rail line adjustment prompted new cartographic surveys, and in the process, some previously designated properties were annotated for relocation or redesignation. One of these maps, drawn in 1882, labeled the refuge structure simply as unused estate. This was the first instance in any official document that omitted the term mission or refuge from the property's description. While public documentation remained thin, private correspondence among missionary affiliates reveals uncertainty during the final months of the site's history. Letters between auxiliary staff in Alabama and Maryland occasionally referenced the NO situation, using abbreviations without elaboration. One note written by a society treasurer stated that continuity was no longer defensible without direct accounting. The phrase implies that internal reconciliation efforts had failed to align funding with known outcomes. Even among loyal administrators, there was recognition that the documentation void could not be sustained indefinitely. That same year, a retired deacon who had once served on the Society's External Advisory Board submitted an unsolicited report to the Episcopal Archival Committee in Baton Rouge. The report, now preserved in university holdings, outlines concerns over the abandonment of formal record-keeping practices in peripheral mission structures. While the report was broad in scope, a footnote refers to a site due south of Esplanade Ridge, formerly under juvenile supervision. The deacon argued for an independent audit, but received no official reply. The society was not obligated to cooperate with external religious bodies, unaffiliated with its founding charter. In the absence of investigation, neighborhood observations formed the only record of the site's physical state during this period. A collection of letters from residents of Marigny and Tremé, housed in the Louisiana Civil Archives, include occasional references to the compound, a term likely used to describe the gated structure still occupying the land. These letters speak of a building that remained visibly intact, yet perceptibly abandoned. One writer described it as maintained in appearance but mute in purpose. Another noted that a man in clerical clothing was seen once a week walking the perimeter. No official society records mention such a presence. A curious document surfaced in 1883 during a property review conducted by a surveying firm under contract with the city. The surveyors, tasked with documenting usable structures for potential municipal repurposing, submitted a list of buildings labeled eligible for civic review. Among them was the former refuge. The notes attached to its entry described a building entirely closed, no interior access, ownership unconfirmed. The structure was deemed non-viable for immediate use due to the absence of any confirmable contact. It was passed over in the next round of reviews. Around this same time, an inquiry was filed by the local office of the Society for Urban Reform, a non-governmental entity advocating for transparency in child welfare institutions. The inquiry requested a record of all documented children placed through the St. Fortunatus facility from 1871 to 1880. The response from the Independent Missionary Society came in the form of a typed note stating, "All children received during that period were handled in accordance with discretionary placement protocols. No municipal identifiers were generated." This marked the Society's final known communication regarding the New Orleans site. The legal landscape of religious exemptions began to shift modestly in 1884, when a newly appointed commissioner in Orleans Parish proposed a resolution to review all standing religious holdings for activity status. While the proposal did not pass into formal ordinance, the discussion prompted several institutions to update their registry entries. The property formerly known as St. Fortunatus was quietly relabeled during this process. It appeared in updated land surveys as vacant ecclesiastical parcel. No longer was it associated with childcare or mission activity. The subsequent years brought silence. The building remained standing, gradually falling into minor disrepair, but never collapsing. Its gates were eventually removed. A local preservation group marked it as architecturally significant, though it did not receive formal protection status. Attempts to trace its operational past met with incomplete records and vanished correspondence. By 1890, few locals remembered its function. Those who did referred to it ambiguously, describing it only as that mission place from a long time ago. Internally, the Independent Missionary Society altered its structure following a leadership change. Regional branches were given greater autonomy and older properties were consolidated or sold. The central registry was updated to remove inactive locations. St. Fortunatus was not listed as closed or sold. It was simply no longer referenced. The language of removal was procedural. No explanation was needed once the administrative function ceased. The absence of closure records created a vacuum filled only by speculation. Historians attempting to reconstruct the operational trajectory of the site found no personal memoirs, no surviving staff accounts, no direct testimony. The few surviving documents from the facility itself consist of requisition lists and inventory logs, many of which are incomplete. No personal effects, letters, or internal communications remain from within the building. Only the Society's outgoing responses and summary reports remain, each crafted in the abstract language of institutional distance. What remains are the fragments of attempted oversight, the clerk's inquiries, the deacon's report, the newspaper notices crafted with deliberate imprecision. These minor efforts formed a quiet chorus of uncertainty, none of which gained momentum or visibility during the years of relevance. They existed only in passing, sidelined by jurisdictional limitations, religious autonomy clauses, and the decentralized nature of child placement in post-war Louisiana. The property itself was eventually transferred to a trust affiliated with a civic preservation foundation. The building was retained as a historical structure with no signage. In 1893, a brief mention appeared in a citywide directory of properties under passive maintenance. The address was listed, but the building name was omitted. No reference was made to its former occupants or institutional purpose. With each passing decade, the details faded further. The children referenced in early intake ledgers never appeared in school lists, census records, or religious confirmations elsewhere in the state. Their names, partial and inconsistently spelled, resisted linkage to any verifiable identity. Attempts to trace them beyond the confines of the facility were unsuccessful. They remained outside the boundaries of known outcomes, suspended in administrative ambiguity. In 1891, a graduate student from the Louisiana Collegiate Seminary began compiling data on defunct religious properties as part of a thesis on postbellum ecclesiastical infrastructure. Her name was Margaret Luce, and her research focused primarily on unregistered structures once operated by northern missionary groups. Her work involved property deed reviews, land surveyor logs, and denominational registries. It was during this process that she encountered a reference to a juvenile placement compound, located on the periphery of New Orleans municipal lines, listed under the disused parcel designation 41BR. Luce's initial observation was purely administrative. Parcel 41BR had no confirmed deed holder beyond 1882, yet had remained tax-exempt for more than a decade. The exemption was preserved under legacy status through the Religious Property Simplification Act of 1879, which allowed listed sites to carry forward designations provided no contradictory activity occurred. What stood out to her was not the absence of ownership but the phrasing used in the 1883 exemption renewal, which stated that the site remains structurally static and therefore retains sanctuary attribution. The term sanctuary attribution did not appear elsewhere in the registry. Out of curiosity, Luce requested access to older land use surveys. Among the files stored in the Municipal Land Records Archive, she found a diagram labeled St. Fortunatus, exterior perimeter only. It included outlines of walls, garden divisions, and 3 internal structures. The diagram had been marked with a blue check in its top corner, indicating that the parcel had not been reassigned. A handwritten note in faded pencil near the edge of the map read, "No declared occupants since 1880. The source of the annotation was not listed. Luce began corresponding with several members of the now retired Missionary Society, which by that time had reduced its operations and consolidated most of its holdings. She located a former administrator, Samuel A. Brister, who had served in the Society's Boston office during the final years of the New Orleans site's activity. Brister, then in his late 70s, agreed to a written interview. His responses were brief and carefully worded. When asked about St. Fortunatus, he wrote only, "The site fell into disuse as all auxiliary holdings eventually must. The nature of its function required no closure statement." Pressed further, he replied once more, stating, "Children in mission care were always considered transitional wards. Record discontinuities are common in the context of provisional custody." He declined additional questions. Luce preserved the correspondence, later attaching it as an appendix to her research notes. She continued her inquiry without institutional support. As she moved through the archive, she began focusing less on the property and more on the individuals once listed within the intake rosters. By cross-referencing shipping records, infirmary logs, and charity correspondence, Luce attempted to locate any mention of the names that had appeared in St. Fortunatus inventory sheets between 1872 and 1875. Of the 17 initial children listed, she found no confirmed sightings beyond the walls of the refuge. A single possible match appeared in the 1880 records of a naval infirmary in Pensacola, Florida, where a child identified only as Nyale was treated for an illness. The surname corresponded to one listed in an 1873 intake ledger, but the infirmary staff had no additional information, and the registry offered no certainty of identity. The child was not mentioned again in subsequent records. Luce's breakthrough came not through names, but through transit documentation. While reviewing the 1874 requisition logs of the Independent Missionary Society's Savannah branch, she located a shipment invoice detailing the transfer of child provisions to 3 separate destinations. One of the listed locations was a property identified as RD Holding South Unit 3. A cross-reference with Society filing codes revealed that RD stood for Rotational Discretionary, a classification used for interim shelters, not registered with municipal authorities. These units served as bypass nodes, facilitating the movement of individuals between larger institutions without permanent assignment. Unit 3 was not listed in public documents. Its designation existed only in internal society records. Further investigation revealed that the structure had been situated near the rural edge of Ascension Parish, outside Baton Rouge. There were no public-facing structures documented on the site, but maps from the period included a structure labeled Intermittent Cottage Unit surrounded by privacy hedging. Luce's contact with the Ascension Parish Tax Office confirmed that the parcel had never been commercially registered and had remained under an unnamed trust until 1886, when it was sold for agricultural redevelopment. The transfer log from Savannah listed 13 individual allotments, coded numerically rather than by name. Each was labeled Indefinite Duration Supervised Intake. The absence of names made confirmation impossible, but the timing and number aligned with the missing children noted in New Orleans records between 1873 and 1875. No subsequent documents clarified the outcome of those placements. The unit ceased to appear in society records after 1876. No final accounting was recorded. Luce assembled her findings into a preliminary report submitted to her faculty advisor. The advisor acknowledged the research, but declined to approve it as a thesis topic, citing the lack of verifiable outcomes. The missing children, in the absence of identifiable records or legal inquiries, could not be named conclusively. Without names, the events at St. Fortunatus remained an institutional pattern, not a confirmed historical incident. The project was not disapproved, but was reclassified as a field study rather than a graduate thesis. Disappointed by the lack of academic traction, Luce stored her research in a private collection and shifted focus to a different topic. She completed her studies with a thesis on property tax reform among postbellum parishes. Her notes on the refuge remained unpublished until decades later, when a historian reviewing missionary site failures encountered the name St. Fortunatus in a minor footnote. The original property had by then been repurposed by a civic foundation, the building left intact but unused. Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. In 1897, a municipal review commission in New Orleans initiated a project to document and preserve unregistered buildings of potential civic use. The commission was formed in response to a series of urban planning delays caused by outdated zoning records. As part of the review, officials compiled a list of properties with ambiguous status. One of these entries, located near the boundary of the former refuge site, was identified as a structure of uncertain provenance, formerly ecclesiastical, no current occupant or record of sale. The structure was examined by a contracted assessor named Frederick Holland. His notes, submitted to the commission in September of that year, described the building as sound in frame, non-operational in function, possessing original fixtures. Holland's report did not reference the name St. Fortunatus, but his diagram matched earlier architectural sketches preserved in the Missionary Society's internal maps. The floor plan included 3 internal corridors, 2 wings, and a locked central chamber labeled simply as retained. The label raised no questions in the Commission's follow-up review. The building was classified as archival and not slated for demolition. During this same period, a retired clerk named Henri Boudreau donated a set of city maintenance logs to a local preservation group. Among the documents was a sealed envelope marked Personal Files, Non-Indexed. Inside were several handwritten notes concerning unprocessed facility inquiries made between 1872 and 1880. One sheet listed a series of initials followed by short remarks such as no confirmation, no return, and redirected without file. Although the entries lacked dates or context, 4 of the sets of initials matched those from the intake list recovered from St. Fortunatus documents. The notations suggested that limited attempts to track children may have occurred through unofficial or unsanctioned channels. The Boudreau documents included a brief letter addressed to a contact in Plaquemines Parish. The letter, unsigned, mentioned recurrent quiet transfers and advised the recipient to accept only verifiable intake. The note referred indirectly to the Riverside Compound, a term that reappeared in other archived communications from the same era. No other document used that exact phrasing, but its context aligns with geographic references found in shipping ledgers and facility maps. In 1898, a committee of historical surveyors reviewed properties under long-term tax exemption without declared institutional use. A draft memorandum recommended the reclassification of 12 properties across Orleans Parish. Among them was the former St. Fortunatus parcel, which had remained without declared purpose for over 16 years. The memorandum described the structure as undeclared and undesignated, with a note indicating that residential conversion inadvisable due to lack of primary deed chain. The recommendation stalled. Religious legacy protections were still active under parish law, and no precedent existed for forced reclassification of such holdings. The building retained its legal standing as a religious property, even though the operating entity no longer existed in any functional form. Responsibility for its oversight shifted to an inactive trust with no listed contact person. Administrative control, once defined by action, had become defined by absence. That same year, a civil registrar named Lyle Chouvet began compiling a list of unidentified minors referenced in civic documents between 1869 and 1885. The list was intended to support new orphanage certification standards that required proof of record keeping for all admitted children. Chouvet's work included reviewing correspondence from dissolved institutions and matching names across parish registers. In the process, he isolated 13 first names that had appeared only once each, all connected to provisional missions. None had documented exits, transitions, or public confirmations. All 13 corresponded to names found in the 1873 ledger associated with St. Fortunatus. The compiled list was entered into a civil supplement under the heading Non-Verified Custodial Mentions. No legal action followed. The entry held no authority and served only as a notation. Its presence within the municipal ledger went unnoticed by the broader commission. The children's names, incomplete and unlinked to any familial identifiers, remained unattached to any civic narrative. Interest in the property diminished as the 20th century approached. The building stood without signage, utility service, or declared occupancy. A single photograph taken in 1899 by a city surveyor documents the southern facade of the structure. It shows boarded windows, an intact roof, and a side entrance secured with a chain. No caption accompanies the image. Its location was marked only by a parcel number. The final document referencing St. Fortunatus within any ecclesiastical or municipal system was a maintenance form submitted in early 1900. The form, unsigned, listed the site under a general facilities category titled Inactive Sanctuary Holdings. The maintenance note described minor roof repair and the removal of encroaching vegetation. No mention was made of interior access. The structure was labeled as maintained externally only. After that entry, the building ceased to appear in administrative records. Later, surveys omitted it. Street names around the site were changed during a redevelopment push in 1902, and the location gradually disappeared from current maps. By 1910, the parcel had been folded into a larger grid without notation. Whatever remained of the structure was no longer associated with institutional memory. In 1911, a retired records clerk named Bernard Sylvain presented a lecture to a regional historical society in New Orleans. His topic was unaccounted religious properties of the postbellum era. The gathering was informal, composed of local archivists, educators, and clerical volunteers. In the final minutes of his talk, Sylvain briefly referenced a structure he described as a ward facility of indistinct origin, located along the former municipal line east of Bayou Road. He did not name it directly, but noted that its ledger trail ended abruptly and that no operational endpoint was ever filed. The remark prompted little reaction from the attendees. Most in the audience were unfamiliar with the parcel or its context. The record of Sylvain's presentation was kept in the Society's proceedings log, which noted only the topic and his affiliation. No follow-up inquiries are known to have resulted from the lecture. The building he referenced had already been omitted from civic planning materials by that time, and its structure was either removed or left to deteriorate without oversight. Over the next 2 decades, references to the facility's past use became sporadic and limited to informal exchanges among local record keepers. A letter from 1923, addressed to the Office of Municipal Lot Reassignment, questioned the parcel's prior function, but was returned with a note stating that no institutional history is available at this time. The property was described in accompanying documents as cleared, though no demolition permit could be located. A second inquiry, filed in 1929 by a parish historian compiling data on regional shelters, received no reply. It was not until 1948 that the name St. Fortunatus resurfaced in a published context. A researcher named Clara Seton, compiling a monograph on educational initiatives in post-war Louisiana, referenced the facility in a single footnote. Her source was a discontinued missionary directory that included an unannotated listing under orphan placement sites, inactive. Seton included the entry only to illustrate the number of such locations without recorded outcomes. She made no attempt to investigate further. In the years following, a handful of graduate students revisited the property's administrative gap as part of broader analyses of child welfare in Reconstruction-era Louisiana. None were able to access first-hand materials from the facility itself. The Missionary Society had long since dissolved, and its remaining documents were scattered across unrelated collections. Most inquiries relied on land records, shipping manifests, and incidental references. The absence of direct evidence limited all interpretations to circumstantial reconstruction. Despite this, certain patterns began to emerge. Independent reviews of transit documents, census anomalies, and ledger notations began to suggest a convergence of activity centered around the site during a precise 2-year interval. These patterns aligned with marginal notes in city files, disbursement inconsistencies in the Society's funding records, and undeclared shipments to facilities in neighboring parishes. The coherence of the timeline was never explicitly confirmed, but the alignment of indicators across different repositories became the subject of internal archival memoranda. By the 1960s, archival interest in post-war institutional opacity had grown. and researchers began informally cataloguing cases in which properties operated without formal termination documentation. St. Fortunatus appeared consistently on such lists. Yet even among those compiling the data, there was limited belief that additional records would surface. The prevailing assumption was that any surviving documentation had either been destroyed, misplaced, or withheld during the Society's consolidation period. In 1972, a preservation initiative was launched by the city to trace all formerly religiously affiliated properties that had since entered private ownership. The initiative focused primarily on architectural heritage and did not involve institutional history. One of the parcels reviewed matched the former location of the refuge. The field agent assigned to the review documented an overgrown lot with fragments of foundation stone. A notation on his form read, "Structure no longer present, remnants consistent with perimeter stone, typical of mid-century mission construction." A year later, the site was reclassified for municipal utility use. The zoning change allowed for its inclusion in a greenbelt drainage system tied to surrounding residential development. No signage, commemoration, or formal acknowledgement was issued. The parcel was absorbed into city infrastructure planning without historical designation. A culvert was installed where the north wall of the former structure had once stood. No materials were preserved. The property was listed in planning maps as non-designated public utility corridor. Interest in the site remained low until the early 1980s, when a faculty member at Tulane University introduced a seminar on lost institutional networks in southern urban centers. The syllabus included a week on unregistered shelters, and among the readings was an excerpt from Margaret Lucy's original notes, recently rediscovered in a family archive. The excerpt described her difficulty tracing name continuity among the children listed in the facility's early ledgers. Students were encouraged to examine record fragmentation and the conditions that allowed institutions to operate with incomplete oversight. One student researching property code amendments discovered that 3 separate structures listed in historical exemption rolls matched buildings associated with St. Fortunatus's operational period. These were not located in New Orleans proper, but in outlying parishes. The matching occurred not through names but through shipping designations and parcel numerals used in late-stage requisition forms. The student submitted a paper proposing that the refuge had served as a processing point in a distributed system of temporary religious custody facilities. The paper received no formal publication, but was stored in the university's departmental archive. In 1991, the Office of Historical Inquiry at the Louisiana State Archive launched a collaborative indexing project aimed at integrating previously excluded institutional sites into the state's Unified Records Directory. The project focused on properties that had once operated under provisional religious charters or missionary agreements prior to 1900. Within that scope, a partial file associated with the Independent Missionary Society resurfaced. Among the index fragments was an undated clerical inventory, labeled with the heading Auxiliary Sites with Active Non-Canonical Function. The listing included only location codes and support structures. One entry, noted as Unit F Crescent Division, bore coordinates that matched the approximate location of the former St. Fortunatus Refuge. Further entries in the same file referenced routine supply correspondence between the New Orleans Auxiliary Site and 3 other unidentified facilities. These facilities were labeled alphabetically and included entries marked P, R, and S. The documentation listed monthly quantities of candles, ledgers, ink, and unsealed envelopes, but no educational materials or standard religious texts. The absence of curriculum items distinguished these locations from the Society's documented instructional institutions. A specialist working on the archive reclassification noted the operational timeline of Unit F ended without notation. There was no entry stating closure, reassignment, or discontinuation. The final shipment record was dated June 1875. No itemized follow-up was filed. The destination column of the last form was left blank. That same year, a local preservation group conducted oral interviews with elderly residents from Marigny and Tremé as part of an initiative to document post-war neighborhood shifts. One participant, aged 92, recalled her grandfather mentioning a quiet place at the edge of the grid, where carts entered weekly but no one ever spoke of what was inside. She was unable to describe the structure itself, having never seen it personally, but stated that older relatives referred to it with the phrase, "House of Silence." No other interviewees used the phrase, and it did not appear in any other historical records. The term was included in the archive only as an anecdotal note. In 2007, a civil historian conducting a survey of 19th-century urban development patterns presented a paper at a regional conference identifying several gaps in child custody documentation between 1870 and 1880. Among the facilities listed as unresolved was St. Fortunatus. The historian's analysis drew from comparative intake reports, identifying discrepancies in intake and release totals among private religious facilities in Louisiana. The report showed 13 cases attributed to the Independent Missionary Society, where the intake was recorded, but the release remained unverified. No other facility within the Society's network displayed a comparable pattern. The paper did not claim wrongdoing, but its inclusion of St. Fortunatus prompted a new round of archival interest. Researchers began reassessing facility transitions during the Reconstruction period using updated digital registries. In the process, 2 additional supporting documents were uncovered in a rarely cited filing cabinet marked Regional Distributions Discontinued. These included a shipping confirmation addressed from the St. Fortunatus site to an unlisted recipient in the Florida Panhandle. The crate contents were described as internal rotation materials, a term found nowhere else in the Society's operational vocabulary. This phrasing led to renewed investigation into the language used in facility correspondence. Analysis revealed that several terms used exclusively in the New Orleans Auxiliary Site's logs had not appeared in records from any other Society-run location. These terms, rotation, retained ward, oversight neutral, were determined to represent internal categorizations for individuals not subject to municipal tracking or reporting. No standardized definitions were recorded. A working group formed within the State Archive to pursue a final resolution on the facility's operational status. Their findings were inconclusive, but confirmed the absence of transition documentation for 13 minors, whose presence had been verified only through early intake records. The working group concluded that the children were documented under administrative conditions which excluded external follow-through. The term administrative exclusion was adopted into the group's final report. Later that year, a preservation foundation initiated a project to mark former institutional sites in Orleans Parish with discrete historical indicators. The St. Fortunatus location was considered but ultimately excluded due to insufficient verification of operational details. The decision was based on policy requiring minimum threshold of archival confirmation for physical designation. The property remained unmarked. In 2015, an independent research journal published an article outlining the complications of reconstructing institutional history from fragmented source chains. The article included the St. Fortunatus site as a case study in procedural ambiguity. The authors argued that its disappearance from operational records, in conjunction with incomplete naming logs and undefined internal codes, presented a model for how custody systems can function. Without post-event accountability, the article avoided speculation and limited its conclusions to structural analysis. No descendant claims have ever been filed in relation to the children listed in the refugees' intake documents. The individuals listed were recorded with only partial identifiers, and no birth records or parish documentation have surfaced to support further investigation. Without surnames or municipal assignment, the records remained untraceable. As of 2025, the location once known as St. Fortunatus is part of a neutral-use green corridor administered by the city's Public Works Department. It contains no structures, markers, or references to prior use. Surveyors continue to list it as an administrative parcel without designated function. Its status remains classified as legacy exemption expired. No plans for redevelopment have been proposed. The site no longer appears in Missionary Society histories, preservation indexes, or civic registries. It exists only as an archival residue scattered across incomplete files, indirect references, and unreconciled intake entries. The children listed have not been matched to any subsequent civic, educational, or residential institutions. Their presence is confirmed only by omission. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story is fictional. All names have been edited to protect the source.